and welcome to Eat Drink Talk. Today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to be making some recipes from my Tehran kitchen. My kitchen in Tehran is pretty tiny, to say the least. It's about 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters, so it is minuscule. I figure if I can make delicious things from here, then you can definitely make them at home. Okay, so we're going to start by making some flatbreads. I think making flatbreads is a really nice thing to make when you want the sensation of fresh bread at home, but you don't want to make big, quite complicated loaves. Flatbreads are really quick, they're really easy to make, and they're delicious. So what we're going to do to get started, we're going to add some water to a bowl. Whenever you make a dough with yeast, the temperature of the water needs to be quite a specific temperature. What you're looking for is you're looking for water the temperature of your own body. So if you think about the warmest parts of your own body, behind your ear, under your armpit, behind your knee, there are other places, use your own imagination, that's the sort of temperature we're looking for. If the water is too cold, it won't activate our yeast. If it's too hot, it will kill the yeast. So just aim for the temperature of your own body. What I'm going to do now is add about 1 tablespoon of yeast, which I'm just going to sprinkle over our water, and then just add a little bit of sugar. And I'm just going to mix that all together just to get the sugar and the yeast to dissolve in the water. Okay, so the next things I'm going to add, 3 things: some salt, some olive oil, and some yogurt. We add salt because salt and yeast don't like each other, so basically adding a little bit of salt just controls the growth rate of the yeast, meaning that we don't get a dough that tastes really strong of yeast. It just lets the yeast sort of do its thing without overpowering our dough. I'm going to add some yogurt. The yogurt I buy here is really delicious. I buy it from a little dairy that's around the corner from us. Turkish, Arab, Greek yogurt, it all has very similar characteristics. It's very, very thick. It's usually made with cream as well as milk. It's pretty amazing stuff. What's important about the kind of yogurt that you use is just that you choose a really good quality natural yogurt. This isn't the time to go and buy, cheap supermarket yogurt. Try and buy good quality yogurt that has a lot of bacterial cultures in it. What that bacterial culture will do is it will act as a natural rising agent, the way buttermilk does if you make scones or pancakes. Those natural cultures sort of act in a similar way to baking powder and baking soda. So I've added a little olive oil, some yogurt, and some salt, and I'm just going to mix that all together. So next I'm going to add our flour. Whenever I make any kind of dough, even if I've made it hundreds of times, I always add the flour slowly and gradually. So just in little increments. I think that what's quite important is not to just dump all the flour in because you've weighed it and the recipe says X amount of flour. Every day your ingredients will behave differently. So for example, today my yogurt could be a little bit wetter than usual, could be a little bit thicker and drier than usual. So by adding our flour in small increments, it just gives me more control. And we want to add just enough flour so that our dough starts to come together. So at the moment it's sort of a gloopy mess. As we add more and more flour, it will start to become more of a sort of a solid dough. Still quite sticky, but you'll see that it will really stick to your spoon. It becomes difficult to turn. And that's when we will start the next step, which is kneading our dough. So obviously measuring is important to some extent, but I think as you make dough more and more, you just get a feel for how much flour. Until basically when your dough starts to become quite clumpy like this is when you want to stop adding flour and then start kneading. And kneading, I think, is something people tend to be quite uncomfortable with. I think maybe if we rename kneading correcting the dough, people would be more comfortable with what you're actually doing. When you knead dough, you're doing 2 things. Firstly, you're getting the moisture level correct in your dough, so your dough will always be too sticky when you start kneading. You will always need to add a little bit more flour. The second thing we do when we knead a dough is we're developing the protein or the gluten in the flour. If you think about that protein or gluten as being like elastic bands, as you're kneading, what you're doing is you're kind of developing those elastic bands so that they become quite long and they stretch, and that's what makes our dough nice and smooth and elastic, so it's that kneading. So when we knead, we put a little bit of flour down at a time, not a big cake of flour. A little bit of flour on our hands, and then I've seen a lot of strange kneading in my time. We're not a cat making a nest for ourselves. What we're looking to do is keep our dough in a kind of a ball shape and then just push it away from you and bring it back. And we're going to do this for about 5 minutes until our dough is nice and smooth and elastic and no longer sticky. So after 5 minutes of kneading, your dough should look something like this. What I'm going to do is just take a clean bowl and pour a little bit of olive oil, just a splash, into the bowl. And then with my hands, I'm just going to run it all around the bottom and the sides, just to give it a nice light coating of the oil. And then we take our dough, put it in the bowl, and just turn it 1 or 2 times, just to give it a light coating of the oil. And then I'm going to cover it with a damp tea towel. So it's quite warm here, so I don't need to put it anywhere special. I can just leave it out in my kitchen to let it rise. If you're in a colder place, what you can do is put your oven on the lowest setting, about 50 degrees Celsius, just for a few minutes, just till you put your hands in it. It kind of feels like, the Bahamas in there. It's nice and warm. Then shut your oven off. It's really important you shut your oven off, and then put your dough in there to rise. Then it has a nice kind of warm environment to rise. Dough does not want like a drafty window ledge or somewhere really cold to rise. It won't rise well. It needs to be somewhere on the warmer side. So we're going to come back to this in about an hour. So after about an hour, your dough will look something like this. So what I'm going to do now is just punch the dough down. Sometimes there's a little bit of violence in cooking. You can enjoy this if you've had a hard day. Just give your dough a little bit of a thwack right in the middle, which will just deflate the dough. The reason your dough has risen is because as your yeast is activated, it's almost like it's breathing, like it's alive. It's giving off carbon dioxide. Those little bubbles are trapped in your dough, and that's what makes the dough rise. So what I'm going to do is just break our dough into some little balls. I'll start with, let's say, 4 of them. So what I'm going to do now is just slap the dough back and forth a few times, and then just start rolling it out. And then what I do is I layer my little flatbreads before I cook them into sheets of paper. So you can use sheets of parchment paper at home. We don't have parchment paper here, so I just use some newspaper. If you wanted to freeze your dough, then what you would do is you would just put them straight onto the parchment and put the parchment right into the freezer with your dough already all rolled out in little flatbreads. That way you can just take them out of the freezer, pop them off the parchment, and just cook them straight from frozen. They just take an extra minute or so as opposed to cooking them from fresh. This recipe, depending how big you make them, will make roughly 8 to 10 flatbreads. If you make small ones, you'll get more. If you make enormous ones, you could get as few as 3. More power to you, I say, if you make huge flatbreads. If you can cook them, why not? Okay. And what's important, you just want to make sure that you dust off any flour so that they have maybe just the slightest coating of flour on them. If they're caked in flour, we don't put any oil in the pan when we cook them. So if they're caked in flour when they go in the pan, that flour will stay on them when they come out and it won't be very nice. So just give them a little dusting off, just to get rid of any excess flour you might have on them. And then we're ready to cook our flatbreads. So I'm using my stove here, which is affectionately known as the Inferno. You can probably guess why. It creates unbelievable heat. It can boil a little pot of water in about 2 minutes flat, which I think is pretty impressive. So what we're essentially doing, we're basically simulating like a tandoor, the clay ovens that they bake flatbreads on in the Middle East, or a tandoori oven in India where they just slap them on the side. So we're just going to get our pan super hot. And the thing with making flatbreads is a little bit like if you've ever made pancakes. The first one is always a little bit slower, and then it just goes. And they're literally like 30 seconds, a minute per side. They're very, very fast to cook. So I'm just going to make sure our pan is super hot. It's on full blast. And again, no oil in the pan. You don't need any oil. And when I make flatbreads, I don't use any kind of utensils at all. I just use my fingers. You'll find in the Middle East there seems to be a kind of a trend, I don't know if it's genetic, but women don't seem to use any utensils when they cook, no tongs, nothing. And they're starting to form some nice bubbles on the top. But the nicest thing is when you start to get quite big bubbles and they puff up, almost like pita bread. It's a really, really fascinating thing to watch. Children love watching this. And this is what I call the corn moment, when they start to bubble up and look all beautiful and delicious. This is what makes all that kneading worthwhile. So to flip over our flatbreads, we just put our fingers towards the center Pull the flatbread up along the side and then just turn them over. Like that. And it can take a little practice, but you'll find after your second batch of flatbreads, you're a natural at this. You see how delicious they look? I just want to eat them straight out of the pan. And that's how we make flatbreads.